Hello everybody, this is Dr. Connors, and in this model we're going to get into Hashimoto's thyroid disease. And in this video we're going to just start to brush on the basics. There's a lot of misunderstandings, misdiagnoses, miscare, in my opinion, when you're dealing with low thyroid. So let's jump into this. So hypothyroidism can be caused by numerous factors. An autoimmune cause of hypothyroidism really accounts for about 90% of adult hypothyroidism. So it's mostly due to Hashimoto's. So when you have an autoimmune disease to the thyroid gland, you have antibodies to the thyroid gland. We'll talk about that in further videos here. It can cause a hyperthyroid, then it's called Graves' disease. So you got this excess spilling of T3 hormone, that's the active hormone, and you end up with a hyperthyroid. Very serious disorder that, in my opinion, you should seek medical attention right away. You shouldn't try to play with that and try to treat that from an alternative perspective. There's new medication that can lower thyroid issues. In days going by, it would be a thyroidectomy immediately. And rightfully so. Hyperthyroid can cause damage to the heart quite quickly. With fibrillation of the heart, could cause a person to have a heart attack as well. It's not something to be played with. Now, Hashimoto's can have episodes where you get this fibrillation of the heart, where you get a hyper response, but the majority of the time it's in a hypo response, and the person's going to have hypothyroid symptoms. Now, most people that have hypothyroid really may not have any overt symptoms yet. So, and the majority of people that have hypothyroid has never been diagnosed with Hashimoto's. Well, that's a misdiagnosis because maybe they've never had antibodies tested. So let's jump into that. So only 10% statistically, people with true Hashimoto's, meaning they have antibodies to the thyroid, really show overt symptoms. Then if you are familiar with Hashimoto's, I'm not going to go through these symptoms. You can pause the video and go over this. Really, the most common are fatigue, depression, constipation, super common, GI problems, common, inability to lose weight, and people finding that nobody really believes they're sick because they may already be treated for hypothyroid by their medical doctor. They're given Synthroid or something like that. They just can't seem to get things in balance as far as symptoms go. They don't feel well. They're still not doing well because it's poorly managed. So remember the stages of autoimmune disease. Stage 1 is a silent autoimmune. So in thyroid issues with Hashimoto's, they have elevated TPO antibodies or thyroglobulin antibodies, but they really don't have any symptoms yet. Most of the time, these people are not diagnosed because there's no symptoms that brought them in to actually have that test done. Stage 2 is they do have elevated TPO and thyroglobulin antibodies with symptoms, but they may have normal TSH values, meaning they haven't really had great destruction of their thyroid gland yet. And so again, most of these people may not even be diagnosed as well. And then stage 3, remember stage 3 is you have elevated antibodies, you have symptoms, and you have tissue destruction wherever that autoimmune disease is affecting. In this case, with the thyroid gland, you will have changes in T3 and T4. You're going to have a lot of different symptoms because of that. So conventional model of hypothyroidism diagnosis. This is where the problem comes in. The patient goes in, I have these symptoms of tiredness, fatigue, can't seem to lose weight, I don't know what's wrong with me, I'm cold, and their TSH is tested. So the TSH is the thyroid stimulating hormone. It's a hormone secreted by the pituitary gland. And if the TSH is elevated, meaning positive, so the TSH is elevated, usually they'll be diagnosed with hypothyroidism. Wrong, because you need to do further testing if that's the only thing you tested for is TSH. And then they're prescribed a synthetic thyroid hormone replacement, and then the TSH is normalized, and the patient's asked to return every year to get that rechecked and to manage their Hashimoto's. Well, they don't even have a diagnosis of Hashimoto's. They have a diagnosis of hypothyroidism. They were never tested for TPO or thyroglobulin antibodies. If they tested for TSH and it was within normal levels, then they're told they're negative, and then their Hashimoto's is really mismanaged because they're told that they have depression, they're told that they have, anxiety issues, you need to get on, hormones or something like that, and it was just completely missed. And it really stems back to the tests weren't done correctly. So you don't just test for TSH. You don't just test for TSH, T3, and T4. You have to test for other markers. So again, typically a person comes in, has overt symptoms, TSH is tested, maybe TSH, T3, and T4, diagnosed with hypothyroid if TSH is elevated and T3 and T4 are suppressed. They're given T4 therapy. That's what synthetic thyroid hormone is. Synthroid is really T4, and then they're tested annually. So that just doesn't work. And why? So understand, I said TSH, thyroid stimulated hormone, is a hormone that's secreted by the pituitary in a circadian rhythm, but also through a negative feedback loop. So when thyroid hormone is low, TSH, the pituitary will be stimulated to release more TSH. So in a perfect world, a person with low free T3 will have elevated TSH, except your life just doesn't work that way all the time. So you can actually measure TSH multiple times through the day, and it will go up and down through the day. So just testing for TSH is highly inaccurate and just immoral as far as lab management and management of a thyroid patient. So TSH acts on the thyroid gland. So it's stimulating the thyroid gland, telling it we need to kick out more hormone. So you'll kick out T4 and T3. Now these are bound T4 and bound T3. They're bound with proteins. But the majority of what your thyroid produces is T4. Really 90 to 95% of what your thyroid produces is T4. T4 is inactive. T3 is active. But actually what your thyroid produces is T4 and T3 that are bound to proteins that are still not yet active. They have to be unbound to go to produce free T3 ultimately in order to bind to thyroid receptors on your cells and actually work metabolically to your body. Now T4 has to be converted to T3 by a protein called, an enzyme called 5-deiodinase. 5-deiodinase actually functions is in all your cells, but it's this conversion of T4 to T3 really takes place in your liver and in your gut and in other tissues as well, but mainly your liver and your gut. So T4 is converted to T3 through this enzyme, and it's still bound T3, and then it has to be unbound to free T3 to work on your body. So when you really look at T4 and T3, over 99% of it is protein-bound T4 and T3. So when you're going to do a blood test, you really should test TSH, T4, T3, free T4, and free T3. Then we're going to talk later on in another video about reverse T3, because T3 can actually be converted, bound T3 can be converted to reverse T3, which never reverses to regular free T3, and reverse T3 does not work as a metabolic stimulator. So reverse T3 is just useless, and that can be another issue that we'll talk about in another video. But if you only measure TSH, T4, and T3, so if your blood test says T4 and T3, it's bound T4 and T3. Kind of a worthless measurement unless you measure the free T4 and free T3. You have to measure that. You have to. You're just not doing a good job. So when you look at this table, let's look at this flow of TSH talking to the thyroid gland and T4 then causing a reverse negative feedback loop to tell the thyroid gland to calm down again, and it makes T3 converts to free T3 ultimately to work on the cells. There's really three major areas where Hashimoto's can cause disruption. It can affect the antibodies themselves and the thyroid gland, number one. That's that number one you see on this slide. Number two, it can cause inflammatory downregulation of the enzyme itself that converts T4 to T3. So if you're not converting T4 to T3 very well, remember 90% of what your thyroid makes is T4. And if you can't convert that to T3, you're going to have all sorts of symptoms of low thyroid, right? And then number three, you could have actually issues with the receptors themselves. So you have to look at all of that to manage the thyroid patient the best. And it's best to understand that thyroid Hashimoto's is really not just a thyroid disease. It's really multi-system as far as the disease pattern goes, and it has a lot of different vicious cycles that could take place that could cause all sorts of problems. Thyroid antibodies could also bind to the cerebellum. The cerebellum is that back part of the brain that controls your spine and eyes, and it controls your balance. And if a person has, Hashimoto's, that attack on the cerebellum can cause all sorts of other weird symptoms. Gluten and other gliadin antibodies can be cross-reactants and molecular mimics. We'll talk about that on other videos. So really, if you have a diagnosis of low thyroid and you haven't yet been tested for antibodies, even if you don't have antibodies, you have been tested for it, you absolutely, even if you have primary hypothyroidism, but certainly if you have Hashimoto's or Graves' disease, you absolutely have to be on a gluten-free diet. The molecular mimicry of gluten to the antibodies is very strong. You have to really stay away from that. And I hear all the time people with Hashimoto's, if they do eat some gluten, they can end up with some dizziness and all sorts of things. That's because of the cerebellum and how it affects other sites as well. It is complex. Your immune system destruction of the thyroid gland decreases thyroid hormones, but that causes all this downstream effect. It impairs the metabolic rate of all cells. That's why people have trouble losing weight. That's why they have trouble, with energy. They have fatigue issues. It can end up with brain issues. I said the cerebellum, but also gastrointestinal, your skin, your other organs, and your muscles. If it's affecting your thyroid receptor, it's certainly going to downregulate the receptor, even though there may not be an autoimmune attack on the receptor, and it's going to cause all sorts of systemic inflammatory responses. It just gets very complicated, and you do want to manage all these things as best as you possibly can. Remember, nothing's going to be perfect, but you have to manage this in looking at it as the web that it really is. It's actually multiple webs when we look at it. So we're going to break these down through the videos in this module. It does get kind of complex, and you're going to have to find your comfort level on how to best manage your disease. Remember, we're studying together, so stay with me through this. I know some of it is getting complex. Some of you are experts at this already, so congratulations to you. Well, let's study together. Know that I'm praying for you, and we'll continue in our Hashimoto's module.